Well, to discuss this, I'm joined here in the studio by Yaser Tabbara. He is a senior fellow at the Omran Centre for Strategic Studies and a former spokesman for the Syrian interim government. From Arezzo in Italy, we have Joshua Landis. He's the director of the Center for Middle East Studies at Oklahoma University. And completing our panel in Washington, D.C., we have Nicholas Heras. He's a Middle East fellow at the Center for a New American Security. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Yaser Tabbara, let's start with you. Is this a win for Assad and his Russian backers, given that there's been this evacuation in Eastern Ghouta?
Well, I think if you look at the situation from a strategic point of view, during the time that they focused on Al-Ghouta and the immense criminality that they've exercised in killing over 1,800 civilians and displacing over 28,000 civilians completely to an entirely different part of the country, consistent with their ethnic cleansing and demographic changing practices over the past 5 years. But if you look at the picture strategically, you'll see during that campaign that they did all of this criminality during, they've actually let an entire region in the northwest completely go from under their control entirely into the control of another nation. We're talking about Afrin in the northwest. You're talking about they've let the Americans and other coalition members basically bombard Deir ez-Zor and kill some of the Russian and Syrian regime troops without any response that can be mentioned. During that period, Daesh engaged in a number of hit-and-run tactics where they're actually re-entered Bukamal and Mardin, and they've lost some control over some of the oil fields there.
So your argument in a nutshell is brutality and, your words, criminality in order to take back this part of Syria while they've lost more ground elsewhere.
Exactly.
Okay, so Joshua Landis, is that how you see it?
Well, clearly the regime, the Syrian regime, has been successful in about 65% of the country. That's obviously good for Assad, bad for the rebels, but it's not a 100% win. The United States claims to own about 30% of Syria in the northern region, where it's helping Kurdish troops, YPG, and the Syrian Democratic Forces, as well as in Tanf, and is blocking highways in and out of Syria. So the United States owns about 50% of Syria's major resources: oil and gas, water, agriculture. Turkey is on its way to conquering perhaps 10% of Syria. Northern Aleppo, Afrin is just cleaned out, and will probably take parts of Idlib province as well, and in alliance with various Syrian rebels. And so Syria is likely to be divided into 3 zones in the future.
Okay. Of
course, we don't know whether the United States will remain. President Trump seems to be rather fickle about staying for the long haul in the north. And so that's the situation. It's good for Assad in the Ghouta. It's bad for Assad north of the Euphrates and in the areas where Turkey is imposing its rule.
Nicholas Heras, was it a good thing that Ghouta was evacuated by the rebels, especially when some point to the fact that the strongest rebel group that was there in Douma was Jaish al-Islam, and they're not necessarily the most moderate of rebels around? Was it a good thing?
You know, this is a very difficult question for a lot of different commentators, because with that question is also the question, was it a good thing that the Assad government and its allies, the Assad alliance, essentially sieged and starved the people of the East Ghouta into submission? You know, that in and of itself is a horrible thing. But the broader narrative, I think, that we can take as we enter 2018 over the course of this next year is that Syria is no longer a cohesive state. It is a geographic space that is fragmented into different zones of control. And the U.S., as has been mentioned, has a rather sizable zone of control. Turkey has another sizable zone of control. The The Assad alliance has the largest by land area zone of control and population, and then you have sort of groups of rebel zones. The way I would frame it is that the operation in the East Ghouta was the brutal conclusion of the fact that the Assad government cannot allow an active insurgent stronghold on the doorsteps of Bashar al-Assad's throne in Damascus.
Right.
And when you look at U.S. strategy moving forward, the U.S. is banking on the fragmentation of Syria and the slow constriction of Assad and his allies to gain more territory.
Right. Yaser, as Nicholas mentioned, brutal conclusion. You spoke about it being criminality. However they got there, they got it back, right? They displaced hundreds of thousands of people. They killed over 1,000 people, injured scores, starved, besieged, you name it. So with that in mind, given the Russian backing of Assad and the fact that they tried this tactic and it worked, no matter how ugly, is there any possibility that they would want to negotiate now?
Well, I mean, first of all, let's revisit what was mentioned in terms of the Assad control, the Assad regime control of 65% of the Syrian territory. I think that in itself is highly disputed if you look at the facts and figures, and if you really dissect the area that is supposedly under the control of the regime.
So Joshua said 65%. You dispute that?
Well, I mean, it's. Are you talking about the presence of the Syrian Arab army in these areas, or are you talking about scores of different militias that are loyal directly to the Iranian Republican Guard or Revolutionary Guard, or are you talking about Russian troops, or are you talking about militias that are not that are loosely affiliated with the Syrian Arab
So how about
army?
I let you expand on it in a moment? Let's get Joshua to clarify then. 65%. We have Yaser saying, what do you mean by 65%? That's not all Assad. That could be Iranian, that could be Russian, that could be a whole medley of players.
He's absolutely right. The Assad regime is weak today, although the military is stronger than it's been for about 3 years, and is probably going to get stronger. There's no doubt that there's a lot of militias that still operate. Some are pro-regime militias. There is widespread banditry, taking of bribes. There's not what you would term as a normal government that is not corrupt and that runs efficiently like the United States. But it is increasingly government control. And one suspects that many of the militias will be squeezed out as time goes on. Now, the United States, by taking away resources, is hoping that it will be able to bring Assad to his knees. That's what Tillerson described before he was fired, that by impoverishing Assad, the Russians, the Iranians, they can turn Syria into a quagmire. This will force the Russians to abandon Assad, impose UN-mandated elections, which Assad will lose. That's the American plan. We don't know if the new national security advisor is going to follow the Tillerson plan, or whether Trump wants to just get out of Syria. So we don't really know what the plan is. Syria is weak today, but it's been getting stronger since the Russians entered in 2015.
And again, I'm not sure.
I'm not that it will get stronger.
Okay.
I'm not sure what is meant really by it's getting stronger. I mean, let's again talk about trends and figures. If we look at the reports of those killed in the Syrian Arab army, we'll see that the higher number of the young men who were forcibly conscripted into the Syrian Arab army were from areas that have been basically displaced and that were populated, whether it's Maadamiya, whether it's the Western Ghouta, whether it's from different parts of Homs and Hama. We are not talking about an army that is regrouping or that is regaining any sort of strength in terms of rank and file conscription. I mean, most of the conscription that what we hear about is actually forced conscription. And we even are seeing that in the aftermath of the Eastern Ghouta disaster, where a lot of the, we have about 200,000 civilians that have refused to actually take the deal and leave.
Right.
And specifically because they're afraid that their sons will be forcibly taken into the Syrian Arab Army and fighting on other fronts. This is not an indication of a strong army by any stretch of the imagination. Right. The role that the Iranian militias have played in encircling Damascus and encircling Ghouta during that campaign does not point to any real presence of the Syrian Arab Army.
Yeah, and it's going to be interesting to see that relationship between the Iranian militias, the Russians, Assad forces, and so forth, as they reclaim more and more of this territory. If they do, Nicholas Heras, let me ask you, with your proximity to the Beltway, or within the Beltway, given that John Bolton's around, Joshua Landis mentioned new national security advisor. Will he follow the Tillerson plan, or is his appointment an indication that Trump wants to get the hell out of Syria, as he suggested, I think, in a tweet?
The fact of the matter is that there's an active debate ongoing right now within the U.S. government, within both the Trump administration, the broader U.S. government, including the U.S. military and career civil servants, about what to do in Syria. There seems to be two poles to this discussion. One pole is to try to continue to maintain a small U.S. footprint in northern and eastern Syria, but in a way as to support local Syrian partners, particularly the Syrian Democratic Forces Coalition, and any other coalition partners like France, the United Kingdom, and potentially the Gulf Arab states that want to stabilize that zone.
Right.
That would, over time, lead to a slow pullout of the U.S. from Syria, because it's a limited mission. It's a stabilization mission, and it's a mission that lends itself ultimately to a deal between the SDF and the Assad government in order to secure that territory. The other pole of the discussion really takes up the argument of how do you diminish Iran in Syria? And that has always been the great question mark about the Trump team strategy. You cannot diminish Iran in Syria without linking the U.S.-led coalition's effort in eastern Syria to the civil war in western Syria, whether by supporting armed opposition in southwest Syria, in Daraa, against ISIS, and thereby linking with the Israelis in order to contain Iran's and Assad's southward expansion, or, which is what has been the focus of news over the last few weeks and months, do you come to a grand bargain with Turkey? Because fundamentally, the Turkish-controlled zone in northwest Syria is the most valuable and strategic real estate if you want to apply pressure on Russia to find a way to get to a deal in a larger agreement between the United States and Russia. Yeah. And that is why Turkey's role and the U.S.-Turkish relationship moving forward in Syria is vital.
Yeah, that's going to be interesting to see if that indeed plays out in that way. Joshua Landis, just before I wrap up, we've seen government airstrikes in Eastern Qalamun, negotiations about evacuations and so forth. So are we going to see more and more of this Eastern Ghouta type thing happening, starting off with Qalamun next?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the Syrian government is determined that they're going to do the same thing in the Daraa area. They want to, of course, take Idlib back. I think Turkey is going to contest the government and will probably win on parts of Idlib. And increasingly, the rebels don't have much strength left unless it's backed by the Turkish army. So even though Assad is weak, as our other commentator has explained, I think very eloquently, the opposition is really finished. And Assad will assert his authority, as weak as it may be, over much of the rest of the country. And it will be divided into these three groups. The big question mark today is, what will America do? Do the Kurds have a future as an independent statelet in the north, or will they be fought over by Turkey and the Assad government?
So there's a line that stood out for me. Let's ask the Syrian on set, who is in opposition to Assad. The opposition is really finished. Is that true?
Well, I mean, just as the last speaker mentioned, Assad is not going to be able to reassert control over the entire territory again. I think that is a thing of a fantasy at this point. I do believe that the attention should be focused right now, the international community's attention, on the question of accountability. There has been a tremendous amount of criminality that has been exercised over the past 7 years. A lot of different parties have exercised criminality, but the most brutal and statistically the most vivid is practiced
But
by...
has it worked and has it finished the opposition?
I mean, if the definition of success is, killing, 500,000 Syrian civilians and displacing another 3 million and internally displacing half of the Syrian population and losing, 50% of the Syrian territory, the definition of success is that, then yes, absolutely, it has succeeded. The international community is advised to go back to the drawing boards and look at Syria as a place that is very much a prime candidate for re-explosion and deal with the root causes of the situation and the problem. And I think accountability, holding criminals accountable, is the first step towards in that direction. Going back to talking about a political solution, perhaps a la the Geneva Communiqué or a different version of it, will potentially put us in the right direction once again. But without that, I don't think we will see peace in Syria or the region anytime soon.
A prime candidate for re-explosion. Well put. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I've got to move on. But gentlemen, I thank you very much. Yaser Tabbara, Joshua Landis, and Nicholas Heras. Thanks for joining us on the Newsmaker.